All right, let's get started with completing the square. So this is another method for solving quadratic equations. It's called completing the square. The trick is getting the binomial squared on the left-hand side. That probably doesn't mean anything yet, but we'll figure it out. Let's observe these binomials, squares of binomials. X plus 2 squared. If you write it out twice in FOIL, you'll get x squared plus 4x plus 4, which is a perfect square trinomial. X minus 6 squared. If you write it out twice in FOIL, you'll get a perfect square trinomial. Note that on the right-hand side of the trinomial, the last term is 1/2 of the coefficient of the middle term squared. I know, that's a lot, right? Okay, so let's look at the first trinomial. What is the middle term? 4x, right? The coefficient would be just 4. So we're looking at that middle 4. If you take half of it, what's 1/2 of 4? That's 2. And then when you square it, you get 4, which is the last term. Let's look at the second one. Again, take half of the coefficient of the middle term. So the middle term is negative 12x. The coefficient is negative 12. So if you multiply that by half, 1/2 times negative 12 is negative 6. And then when you square it, you still get the last term. So that's important. That's what we're going to do to figure out what the last term is. See, we're not going to have the perfect square trinomial built for us. We're going to have to figure it out ourselves. All right, here we go. Okay, here is the procedure for solving quadratic equations by completing the square, CTS. So to solve a quadratic equation, quad 4, notice on the left-hand side, ax squared plus bx plus c. There's 3 terms, and on the right of the equal sign, there's a 0. There's our 4. Number 1, move the constant to the right-hand side. So whatever that c is, that constant, we're going to kick it over to the right-hand side. Leave a space after the bx term. So we want our own number there. What we're trying to do is build a perfect square trinomial. So most likely it's not a perfect square trinomial the way it is. Okay, step 2, divide by a on both sides to get x squared on the left-hand side. So if there is a number in front of the x squared, we have to divide everything by that number. So if it's 5x squared, you have to divide everything by 5. If it's negative 3x squared, you got to divide everything by negative 3. Okay? Step 3, multiply the coefficient of the x term by 1/2. That is the same as dividing by 2, but sometimes there's fractions, so that's why we say by 1/2. But dividing by 2 is the same thing. So multiply the coefficient of the x term by 1/2 and then square the result. Add this number to both sides. So we're going to add it to the left, but whatever we do on the left, we've got to do to the right. Number 4. So now on the left-hand side, what we have is a perfect square trinomial. It can be factored and then written as a binomial squared, or the square of a binomial. We can also simplify it on the right-hand side. And then here's the punchline, number 5. We're going to solve using the square root property. That's what we just learned, right? Okay, let's do it. Okay, here's our first problem. X squared minus 6x minus 2 equals 0. Notice that this cannot be factored. So that's why we have completing the square. In the next video, we're also going to learn about the quadratic formula. But let me just say that without completing the square, there is no quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula is obtained from the method of completing the square. Okay, so what is our first step? The first step is we need to move the constant to the right-hand side. So we're going to move the constant to the right-hand side. That's a -2. When you move a term from one side to the other, the sign will change. Then we're going to take 1/2 of the x coefficient, square it, and add it to both sides. So that's kind of a lot right there, right? First thing is, let's move the 2 over to the right-hand side. Don't forget, kind of leave a space after the x term. So here we go. X squared minus 6x space equals 2, positive 2. Now we're going to take 1/2 of the x coefficient, that's -6. So 1/2 times -6, that'll give you a -3. You could always put a 1 underneath the -6 if you want to. You can multiply that on your calculator if you have trouble with fractions. But if you have trouble with fractions, you should learn fractions. Yes. Okay, moving on. Okay, so we took 1/2 of -6, which is -3. What's next? Right, square it. Whenever you square a negative, it's going to be a positive. So this result is always going to be a positive number. So what are we going to do with that 9? We're going to add it to both sides. Whatever you do to one side, you got to do to the other. +9 plus 9. Now on the left side, that is a perfect square trinomial. You could factor it. So we're going to factor the left-hand side and write it as a binomial squared. And then we're going to simplify the right-hand side. That's easy. You're just going to add 2 plus 9. Okay, so if you factor it, it does factor to x minus 3 times x minus 3. But notice that number, -3, that appears in both binomials. It's half of the middle term, half of the x coefficient, the number before you square it. So you really don't have to work too hard at factoring. You already have the number. It's the number before you square it. Okay, so if you skip that factoring, just take that number, half of -6. It's going to be x minus 3. So x minus 3 squared. It's squared because there's two x minus 3's, right? X minus 3 times x minus 3. So it's always going to be this pattern. X plus or minus, depending on the sign, the number before you square it, that's all in parentheses, and then squared. Right, hopefully you'll get used to the pattern as we go on. What's next? The square root property. We just did this in the last video. You get rid of the square on the left-hand side, put a square root on the right-hand side, and don't forget the plus and minus. And now we could add the root of both sides, and we're all done. 3 plus and minus square root of 11. Let's try another. You might want to pause the video, try to work it out, and come back when you're ready. Okay, step 1. 2 and 3, I suppose. Move the constant to the right-hand side. That's a -1. Kick that over to the right. Take half of the x coefficient. In this case, it's -10. So you're going to take half of negative 10, whatever that number is, you're going to square it, and then that number gets added to both sides. So here's our first step. The 1 becomes negative. Leave a space because we're going to need to add a number. Okay, what is that number? Here we go. 1/2 of negative 10 is negative 5. Now we square it. 25. Is that a positive 25 or a negative 25? Right, it's positive. It's always going to be positive there. So add 25 to both sides. Now again, you shouldn't have to work too hard to factor that. It's always going to be the number before you square it. But if you want to work on it, what multiplies to be 25 and adds to be negative 10, that's negative 5. Negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25, and adds to be negative 10. But again, we already have that number. It's half of negative 10. So it's x minus 5 squared equals 24. What's next? The square root property. Get rid of the square on the left-hand side, put a square root on the right-hand side, and don't forget the plus and minus. And then add 5 to both sides. You're all done. So this is the procedure. It's going to get a little bit more complicated, maybe some fractions, but it's still the same procedure. Okay, here's our next example. Same steps. Move the constant to the right-hand side. Take 1/2 of the x coefficient and square it. Add this result to both sides. So first thing is, move that 13 to the right-hand side. It becomes negative when you move to the right-hand side. Okay, half of the x coefficient is 2. So 1/2 times 2. 1/2 times 2 is 1. And then what's next? Right, you square it, which is still 1. So that 1 gets added to both sides. So now we don't have to really work hard at factoring that, do we? It's going to be inside the parentheses, x, and then the number before you square it, or 1/2 of the x coefficient. It's a 1. Is it a positive 1 or a negative 1? Positive, so it's going to be x plus 1 squared. And on the right-hand side, we simplify that. Negative 13 plus 1 is negative 12. Now we can use the square root property. Square root property, get rid of the square on the left-hand side. Put a square root on the right-hand side. Don't forget the plus and minus. Okay, we have a square root of a negative. That means we're going to have to use the I, right? The I comes out. Then we have a positive 12 inside. Square root of 12. Simplify that. 2 times 2 times 3. So a 2 comes out. A 3 stays inside. So here's taking the I out. Now it becomes positive. And then there's a 2 that comes out and a 3 stays inside. Last step is to move the 1 over. So subtract 1. You can leave it like that. Some teachers might be really a stickler on putting the I at the very end after the square root of 3. So definitely check with your teacher. If there's not a fraction, I kind of like it like that. Negative 1 plus or minus 2i square root of 3. If there is a fraction, if it's like 3 square root 7 over 5, then I want the I at the very end. Again, that's just preference. Definitely the I term has to be last though, and the square root should be last. Okay, here's another one. Still the same process. The last one we had complex numbers, a negative in the square root. This one we're going to get fractions. Okay, so same thing though. Move the constant to the right hand side. Take 1/2 of the x coefficient, square it. That's the same thing. Add this result to both sides. Same thing. Fractions are fine, so leave it improper. Don't change it to a mixed number. Don't change it to a decimal. Just leave it as an improper fraction. All right, you'll see what I mean. First step, add 3 to both sides. So the 3 becomes positive. Okay, now we got to figure out what number are we going to add. Well, we're going to take 1/2 of the x coefficient, so 1/2 times 5. Think about the 5 as a 5 over 1. So if you multiply straight across, that gives you 5 over 2. What's next? Right, we square it. Square both top and bottom. That's 25 over 4. So that's the number that we're going to add to both sides. Okay, now we want to write the left-hand side as a binomial squared. And we're going to add on the right-hand side, simplify the right-hand side. So that means on the left-hand side, it's a perfect square trinomial. It factors to the same binomial twice. But we don't have to stress so much. We already have the number. It's the number before you square it, 5/2. Is that a positive 5/2 that we have? Or a negative? Right, it's a positive. So it's going to be x plus 5/2, all squared. Okay, so you just have to shift your eyes to the right a little bit. You already have the number that goes inside the parentheses. Okay, on the right hand side, we need to add 3 plus 25 over 4. I put a 1 underneath it. Whenever you add two fractions, you got to make the denominator the same. So the denominator of the 3 is a 1, so it needs to be a 4. So multiply top and bottom by 4. That'll give you 12 over 4. And now we can add the two numerators. That's 37 over 4. And now we could use the square root property. Get rid of the square on the left-hand side, put the square root on the right-hand side, and don't forget the plus and minus. There we go. We got rid of the square on the left-hand side, we put the square root on the right-hand side, and we didn't forget the plus and minus. Okay, so now some simplifying there. It's the square root of 37 over the square root of 4. We can simplify square root of 4 to 2. Right? Square root of the top over the square root of the bottom. Now the 5/2, we need to get the x by itself, so move the 5/2 to the right-hand side. When you move the 5/2 to the right-hand side, it becomes a negative 5/2. You want to put it before the plus and minus because the radical term is always last. So that gives us x equals negative 5/2 plus and minus the square root of 37 over 2. I know this is a long problem. I ran out of slide here, right? So we got to write to the right. Now, since those denominators are the same, we don't have to get a common denominator. We can just combine it to one fraction. It's not a complex number, so leave it as a single fraction. If it were a complex fraction or a complex number, then we will leave it separated. right? If we have the I, then we have to keep them separated. Yeah. Okay, so write it as a single fraction. That's -5 plus and minus the square root of 37 over 2. I know that was a long one. One more and then we're done. Okay, all the problems that I did, they all started with an x squared. It doesn't always happen, right? So keep that in mind that if it doesn't have an x squared by itself, we got to get rid of that 3 that we have here. Also, they've all been in order with a 0 on the right-hand side. If for some reason you have a problem and it's not in order, then we need to put in order. If we don't have a 0 on the right-hand side, then we have to get a 0 on the right-hand side. How do you get a 0 on the right-hand side? Move the terms from the right-hand side to the left-hand side, and then combine any like terms. Okay, first step here is to move the constant again to the right-hand side. Then we're going to divide by 3 to get the x squared by itself on the left-hand side. Okay, so first thing is I move the 4. It actually doesn't matter which one you do first. If you wanted to divide all of them by 3, you could. So steps 1 and 2 are interchangeable. If you're looking at other videos or maybe a textbook, they might have 1 and 2 steps in reverse order. They're both fine. Okay, so now our next step is to divide all of them by 3. 3, 3, 3. Everybody gets a 3. So in the first term, 3's cancel. Then we get 2/3 x in the middle term. And on the right-hand side, 4/3. Don't forget to leave a space. Okay, what number are we going to add? Now we need to make a perfect square trinomial. Half of the x coefficient, and then square it. So 1/2 times 2/3. Well, the 2's cancel, so you should just get 1/3. And now you're going to square it. That'll give you 1/9. So that's our number, 1/9. That's the number that gets added to both sides. Okay, now we need to factor the left-hand side. But again, don't worry. You already have the number. You're going to write your parentheses. It's going to be x plus, because it's x squared plus, if it's x squared minus, it would be x minus the number before you square it. What's the number before you square it? You just look over to the right. Oh, it's 1/3. So it's x plus 1/3 squared. And on the right-hand side, we need to get a common denominator, which is 9. So multiply the bottom of 4/3 by 3 and the top of 4/3 by 3. That makes it 12/9 plus 1/9. Add the 12/9 plus 1/9, 13/9. Now we could use the square root property. Get rid of the square on the left-hand side, put a square root on the right-hand side. Don't forget the plus and minus. On the right-hand side, square root of the top over the square root of the bottom. Square root of 13 just stays square root of 13. Square root of 9 is 3. Now we're going to move the 1/3 to the right-hand side. When you move the 1/3 to the right-hand side, the sign will change. So it's negative 1/3 plus and minus the square root of 13 over 3. They have the same denominators, so we can combine it. There's no I, so we can leave it as one fraction. There's our final answer. Negative 1 plus and minus the square root of 13 all over 3. Okay, that's it. I'll see you here for the next video. Have a good one.